There's a lot of content these days about what to do if you've been laid off. But what happens if you've actually survived the layoffs?
That's right. On today's episode, we're going to give you a roadmap for what to do if you find yourself in the fortunate/unfortunate position of surviving a layoff. And this actually happened to Kaila and me at Morning Brew Inc., so we'll share a little bit about that story. Let's get into it. Okay, we are back for another episode of Per My Last Email, and as you heard in the intro, we're going to do this episode on how to navigate post-layoff, but you've survived the layoff and you're still at the company. Now, obvious big caveat here. The people that are most affected by a layoff are the people that get laid off. You lose your economic,
Of course,
you lose money. That's important in society. You're definitely embarrassed. All of those feelings that many of us have gone through in one way, shape, or form through our careers and went through a layoff. That group is the most important group to care for. Mm-hmm. So I just want to caveat before we get every comment that's like, you're forgetting about the people that are actually laid off.
We've talked about this in the past.
We've talked about that in the past. Yeah. We're not forgetting about them. Obviously, they're the most affected group. What we have found, though, is that there is a lack of content around what do you do and how should you think about your career and navigating your career if there's a layoff at your company and you find yourself in again, it's a mix of fortunate and unfortunate, there's mixed feelings, position of survival, and you're still there. Should you stay at the company? Should you start looking? Are you going to get a whole bunch of new responsibilities?
Right.
How should you think about that? There's these big juicy questions that, I think we haven't talked enough about. So that's what we're going to cover on this episode. And a bit of a personal story here is that, like, Kaila and myself, we went through this exact situation at Morning Brew Inc., where we had layoffs. A lot of our colleagues, a lot of our really close friends were, casualties in that layoff. And me and Kaila stayed at Morning Brew Inc. And so we'll use that as the backdrop to walk through how we thought about it at that time and how we think about it in the future.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. I think that's conversation over.
All right,
podcast
perfect.
over.
Thanks for listening.
No, I think that this is a really important topic because I think it is overlooked so often, and I think it is possible that there are a lot of big emotions for somebody who has actually survived a round of layoffs that are not just happiness, relief, I'm still at the company. There's a lot of guilt and dread and concern about what's next and is their job safe?
Yeah.
That I think is worth talking about. So there's a few things that we wanted to go over. Mm-hmm. First, obviously, we've experienced this. So thinking back on what we went through, what were we feeling? What advice did we wish we had in those moments?
Yep.
Whether it's your emotions, the changing work that you have to do, your identity changing, how to talk about this publicly. So we're going to go through all of those. But first, let's talk a little bit about what actually happened with us.
Yes, and I will say before we get into that one last thing, my buzzword. I hope this doesn't happen to anyone.
Yeah.
But I think this conversation is coming at a time where a lot of people are nervous that this might be coming, and so we want to arm you with this in advance.
Yep.
And again, hopefully it doesn't happen to you. Yeah. Let's set the scene. So the year is 2023.
I don't remember.
I think it's 2023. So. we're prepping for this. Episode we forgot the year. We're like, damn
it was 3 years ago.
Yeah. 3 years or so ago, Kaila, myself, and 10 other people so were part of Morning Brew Learning. We were building mini 1 to 8 week MBA courses for our audience. And that program, that department, that division at Morning Brew existed for about 3 years. Mm-hmm. At the end of 2023 or whatever the correct year was, Morning Brew decided we're not going to move forward with this division. We're not going to have Morning Brew Learning, and therefore we don't need most of the people who are working specifically on Morning Brew Learning. And so they essentially laid off everyone, and then Kaila and I were asked to stay on in different capacities. And so that's the backdrop in which we're going to talk about this conversation.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
So let's first start with emotions. Mm-hmm. Kaila, how did you feel when you first heard the news?
Yeah, so it's complicated, right? Because there's a lot of emotions that happen when you are being told in the same breath that the thing that you have worked on and built for 3 years, grinding for 3 years on, kept trying, growing with this division, coming up with this stuff basically from scratch, is not working and we're not moving forward with it. And also that we're keeping our jobs in some capacity was very weird.
Yeah.
Like I was,
it's a cocktail of emotions.
Exactly. I was devastated for a variety of reasons, but also for my own career. I was devastated. I was like, I really wanted to keep working on this stuff. And also relieved that I still had a job, but we were working with such like lovely, wonderful people that
who are still
our close friends.
Close friends today.
Yeah, we visit them, they visit us, we hang out.
Kayla's describing friendship for everyone listening.
We go on trips.
We text.
We drink. We're all still very close, but in that moment, I think it was really hard because there was some uncertainty. I felt very strongly for them. I felt survivor's guilt. I felt guilty of the fact that we weren't leaving.
Yeah.
Like everyone else was. And then there was like the micro emotions of in that exact moment, we knew before they did. And so for like 2 days, we had to sit with this information and legally we could not say anything.
Yeah.
And that was really hard too, but that's more of like a micro. The macro emotions were a lot, stronger and bigger. What about you?
I think my main emotion at the time was sadness for others. I think for me, like I've always, it's hard to hear like something is ending and I didn't want it to end, but I've always been someone who's like, okay, like on to like we have to move on to the next thing. So maybe I could have done a better job of processing my emotions. But the thing that did get me very teary-eyed and sad was like feeling like I'd let down my friends in some capacity because like we couldn't make it work. And, particularly for us who had teams, like when you sign up for a company, a mission, whatever it might be, and you're the manager of people, like in some ways you are kind of protecting their economic livelihood. Not that it has to be like that serious, but like you are like, fuck, like, you guys are in a worse position than you were yesterday. And like, I'm supposed to be kind of the steward of your career and like a colleague, and like I didn't get it done for you. So that sucks. And so there was sadness definitely there, and I think that was like the prevailing emotion. I think it's a little bit ironic because I'm going to give some advice for people who survive a layoff, and a lot of that advice is like, don't make it about yourself. Yeah. I understand the deep irony of we're doing a podcast making it about ourselves right now. It's been multiple years, so I think we're in the clear. But I would say there's like, I turn to action when I'm like, okay, I'm sad and, I've let these people down. Like, what can I do to help? That's what I started thinking about. I think there's a good way to go about helping, and there's a very cringe way to go about helping.
Oh, yeah.
I think the cringe way is like the next day or that day to hop on LinkedIn and be like, we lost a lot of morning brewers. Like like you're in a campaign of war. Yeah. This evening. I wasn't one of them. I wasn't one of them, but my brave comrades have laid down their arms.
Hire them, please.
Hire them. It's like the spirit of it is great, and like, but it's not actually that helpful. And I feel like in terms of the value people get from those posts, it accrues more to the people that are posting and less to the people they're trying to help. And so I've always found that a bit cringe. And instead, what I would recommend you do, and what I tried to do, is like be very tactical with it. Like, okay, let them process, but like the next week, checking it, what is your dream next role? Who do I actually know that could help you land that dream role? Make an actual warm intro. You don't want to go wide and be like, we lost a bunch of people on LinkedIn, like blah, 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 blah. I think you just have to get very tactical and like really support someone, check in, make sure they're doing good emotionally, but then make actual connections where possible. That I think is much more well received. It's private. It like feels more friend to friend as opposed to making it about yourself. So I would avoid that if you're a layoff survivor. You don't need to post about it.
No, I strongly agree with that, and I think it is ultimately not about you, which I think is what makes it that much harder to process your own feelings about it.
You almost feel like you shouldn't.
You should. I mean, like, I'm lucky. Why would I even feel these emotions about this thing?
Even us making this episode, we've caveated it like 8 times.
Right, like, and like
we feel guilty.
We were like, gosh, I don't think we should talk about this because it is hard. Like it is really challenging, and I think like the reality is it's not about you. And also, ignoring your very real feelings about the situation will make them worse.
Yes.
And they will come out in weird ways, and you post like dumb shit on LinkedIn because you're trying to like assuage your guilt.
Yeah.
And like the reality is you probably are not the person who made the decision on who to lay off and who not to. Like in most cases, it's not, you weren't like pointing the trigger at a person's career, you know?
You didn't press the big red button.
Right. And so I think like it is not your fault that other people have gotten laid off, and yet the guilt is very real. So I love being action oriented in order to try and help. But some people like will be processing this in their own way. Like you being like, hey, let me help you. They're like, actually, no.
It's been
like,
12 minutes.
Yeah, like I don't want your help. Like I'm feeling pissed. I have my own range of emotions, and like you trying to like, you know, parachute me out of a place into this. And I think it's just a very like case by case situation where I think in our situation that action was very helpful. It also wasn't instantaneous.
Yeah.
So the layoffs or the shutting down of the company, the division was announced, and then there was a few weeks before those jobs ended.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I would say like how to help depends on your relationship with your colleagues. Obviously, naturally, you're closer with some, so you understand them better. You understand how like you can help them, your friends. Others are more kind of strictly colleagues. And for those people, like, don't jump in right away assuming you know how to help. Like, give them some space to process. Let them know in some capacity, like, if they need you, you're there. But I don't think you have to go, like, crazy and start doing all this stuff on their behalf that they maybe didn't ask for.
Right. And I also think, like, when you're thinking about your emotions as somebody who survived a round of layoffs, like, you should be talking about them, but I would say to a trusted, unrelated third party, not to the people that got laid off. Because my first inclination was to be like, man, I feel really bad, like to the people who were affected. I actually don't even, I'm sure I did that, to be honest. Like, that's not great. I don't know. I don't remember, but like, that would be my inclination to be like, I feel really bad too. Like, this sucks. This is horrible. Like, I'm so sorry. And they probably don't want to hear that, but like a third party unrelated, or for example, like we had each other. Yeah. We talked about these complex emotions together and helped to kind of process them a bit.
Yeah. That's a really, really important shout there. We've covered the emotions.
Yes.
I want to move on to kind of the change of work that is all but guaranteed to happen after layoffs. By that, I mean, there's layoffs, there's less people to do the work, there's probably still a lot of work to do. You're going to find your role shifted or modulated in some capacity. If the marketing team gets shrunk, now you have to do more in marketing, or you're like us, like the division goes away and now you're doing something completely different and your work looks a lot different. So, Kaila, what advice do you have for people who find themselves in this position in terms of evaluating their new work and how to like figure out if their role is expanding, how to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this also goes back to the emotion, but it's like the same advice that we provide when you're thinking about where you want to go next, like what you want your next job to be. I think this is a really dangerous spot to be in for burnout.
Totally.
Because as we've talked about in the past, burnout is not just having more work, or having too much work. It's a lack of agency and the idea that whatever you do doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And so if you just survive this round of layoffs and you're not sure what's coming next, you are now emotionally having to kind of keep that down, but then also add more to your workload. You're not sure if you want to do it. You're not sure if this is like the next job you want to be doing. You're more at risk for feeling like, I don't even want to do any of this.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at the stats, it backs it up. Like those people are at a much higher chance of burnout, like statistically. And I think there's always this lingering background stress of like, are there going to be more layoffs? Right. Like, one bad thing happened, like, is more coming, which is not the psychological safety you need to create to do your best work.
Exactly. And so when you're evaluating kind of the day-to-day tasks that you're doing and what you want to be doing, I think just take it the same as you would if you're deciding to look for a new job, which is, what are the tasks that I'm expected to do? What am I being evaluated on? How is success measured for me moving forward? If I am comfortable with those things and I think I can achieve them, then like maybe I stick around. If I can't, then maybe I have some candid conversations with, the people around me, or even start interviewing.
Yeah, I think this is a very critical period, is like the first 30 to 60 days after layoffs are announced and you survive them, to figure out, are you staying or are you going?
Yeah.
And that is the core question you need to identify in those first 60 days. If you're sticking around for a year and things are still like, you've never done this, and now you're like in a weird position where you're doing more, but you're not making more money. You're more stressed when you don't need to be. Maybe you should have been looking for a new role this entire time, but you weren't. Like, you want to avoid that. You don't want it to be a year and you're still facing all of the stress you had initially at this moment. So figure out if you want to stay or go. So I love your advice. Like, sit down and identify with your manager, one, like, what are actually concrete my like new tasks I'm adding on? And I think you can ask the question, like, I'll just be blunt, like, the layoffs are very challenging for everyone. I know we as a company have assured us that no more layoffs are coming. Hopefully your company has said that, whether they follow through or not, like TBD. And I am taking on more tasks than I used to, but I'm getting paid the same. And like what would it take to get a raise in this situation? You don't do that the next day, but I do think that's a conversation you have at the next check-in, like appropriate check-in. There is a real thing here where like you are now doing more work for the same pay, and that seems a little not fair. And so you should have that conversation appropriately. This is like, major red flag, big trap for quiet promotion, which is effectively what you've been handed, whether you like it or not, if you survive a layoff, is now you're doing more work for the same pay, a quiet promotion. And you don't want to be there. You need to get clarity on that, again, at an appropriate time, maybe 30, 60, 90 days down the road. Not the first thing you ask when the boat was just on fire, but you should make sure you feel comfortable with the new role, the new comp. And the last thing I'll say is, I think this is the point where you really want to have faith in your manager. Like, if your whole team is laid off and you're reporting to a manager you don't have faith in, you don't trust, like, at that point, I would start looking for a new role, candidly. If you still feel rock solid, like, no, like, I either got a new manager that I really trust, or like, I've had a good relationship with my manager, I'm confident they're going to tell me the truth, help us navigate this together. I think that can push you more into the stay bucket, but you need to get really clear about that.
And we'll be right back after this. Okay, back to the show. Yeah, and I think that if you're like in a toxic environment or have a toxic boss, the inclination when you come to them with that question is like, you should actually be grateful that you still have a role. And like, just take this new stuff and just do it, because at least you haven't been laid off. At least you
have a job.
Yeah. And I think especially in this economy, it's really easy to internalize that and to feel like I actually can't ask for anything else because otherwise I am on the chopping block. And so I think having those conversations, again, at an appropriate timeline, but like having those conversations honestly with a manager that you trust should at least garner like data points about what you need to do in order to get a formal promotion or formal raise. But if they respond to you like, you're actually just going to do this and you're going to like it because otherwise you would be, out on the streets or whatever, then it's time to start looking.
And to me, like, that's almost like, that's like a weird tactic that you should avoid.
No, it's toxic.
Yeah,
Don't
exactly,
do that, obviously.
Exactly. But like, if you hear that, like, one red flag should pop up in your brain, like, oh, okay. I would like separate the two. There's like the emotional processing of the layoff. Do that. Take care of yourself. Take care of others. Line. The next phase is like, now this is the new company. Forget the layoff ever happened. Would you accept this job for the current pay?
I like that a lot.
Like, just ask yourself that question. If the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, you don't need, you can have that conversation. They can't hold this layoff over you forever. And so just don't be afraid to have that, again, at an appropriate time. There's another element that happened to us, Kayla, which is we weren't in the marketing department and the marketing department got trimmed and now we have to do more marketing. If that was the case, we would all be screwed because we don't know anything about marketing. The case was we moved to different parts of the organization and took on basically entirely different roles. How did you think about, like, is this a good opportunity? Like, Morning Brewing just announced layoffs. Do I want to keep working at this company? Am I going to be confident enough in my new role? How should I scope this out? Like, how did you do that? Because I think that is a situation that often happens. Layoffs happen, and then you get an entirely new role offered to you, and you have to decide, should I stay or should I go?
Yeah, so I'm interested in how you approach this because I don't think I did this the right way. Like, I do think that I was burned out from the role that I was doing. And then this new role was an opportunity to try something new. And I've talked about this in the past. I was so frustrated by what had happened. And what had happened was we weren't tied closely enough to revenue. We weren't performing enough. We weren't developing enough revenue, making enough money.
We weren't developing enough revenue in the laboratory of business. Yeah, we weren't making money.
The money tree was bare. And so, I was so scared about getting laid off that I crafted a job that I was confident was going to be making money.
Just like so intimately tied to revenue.
Exactly. And I was also burned out. And so for me, what that meant was I wasn't like, how do I create the best job for what I want to evolve in my next steps? I was just like, how do I avoid this feeling ever again? And it was to tie myself to revenue. And we've talked about this in the past, so I won't like harp on it too much, but it did require a lot of evolution. And part of that evolution was me kind of like stepping back from the job. Like I was working so much. I was so invested in the outcomes and I had to like break that a little, which was easier to do because I was working on a team of one. I was, reporting to the then CEO who like was very helpful when we had our meetings, but was super busy. So like I wasn't getting a lot of hands-on managerial help from him.
Yep.
And so I was kind of able to like coast a little. So I wasn't doing that like shift. I was kind of breaking my relationship with work and then built it up slowly again over like a year.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like as somebody who has really been like thriving in their role since the beginning and has stayed in that same role, how did you approach that change?
Yeah, I don't think you did it wrong in any way. I think that was actually just very candid about being burned out and like finding a role that fit the moment and then kind of rebuilding it into whatever you want it to be in the future. I think the smartest thing I did was straight up in a conversation with Austin, the former CEO of Morning Brew Inc., who was CEO at the time of this layoff decision. I told him, I was like, I don't want to stay here if this is like some pity, like, oh, we really like you and like we want to make it work and so we're not going to lay you off. Like if in 6 months we're still having the conversation about like what am I doing here? I would rather just get fired. Like just give me the severance. Like, we had a great run, but like I don't want the like pity role that then I'm just like delaying the inevitable. So I was like very clear, like I don't need to work here. I want to work here if I like the role and it adds value to Morning Brew. Like I want this to be a peer evaluation of like me in a new role. Forget all the history of me working at this company. And I just think that was very smart because I think there is this inertia to stay where you are, particularly post-layoff, where you're like, oh, I'm just grateful to have a job and I'm just going to stay here. And in one case, that's fair. In the other case, you end up just delaying and working on something you don't want to do. So I just got very clear, like, I'm fine leaving. And I got comfortable with that with myself. And then I could really evaluate the opportunity from I think a clearer perspective than I would have if I didn't make that clear to myself and to others. And then the other thing I think I did was I really like indexed on who I would be working with. I felt like if I'm going to have an entirely new role and have to rework like working relationships with everyone at the company, like I'm going to need a lot of support, guidance, mentorship in that. And so I have to believe in the person I'm reporting to. And it just so happened that at the same time, Robert, who is our current CEO, was joining the company as COO. And so I kind of used that, like, let me decide what my role would be here, 30 days, like sussing that out. And I met a lot with Robert and he needed help in a variety of ways I thought I was like particularly beneficial towards. And I just really liked him. And I was like, okay, like if the job isn't exactly what I wanted, at least I'm working for a manager that I'm like really pumped about and can learn from and like he'll help me figure this out. So that was really important to me. And I mean, that ended up paying a lot of dividends because Robert is fantastic and I've learned a ton from him. So my hypothesis ended up being correct. And I think that was really important at the time.
So do you feel like your working identity shifted with that break?
Yeah. I think that's like the next bucket we wanted to talk about, which is your working identity. And it's interesting because we had developed, I think, a good reputation internally at Morning Brew Learning.
Yeah.
Like, we weren't making money, as Kayla said, important.
We were not making enough money.
Yeah, exactly. But like, in general, I think the division and department was well perceived. People liked us. So like, I had a good reputation of like, oh, this person's like enjoyable to work with and smart and all that stuff. But like, we had a reputation for being Morning Brew Learning people. And I think you need to break that like right away. And so what I did to kind of rebuild my working identity, working relationships, because you don't want to rest on your laurels. Those are gone now, is just meet with like every person that I was going to be working with and like starting from this is my role as chief of staff to the then COO. Here's what I'll be focused on. Here's how I think we're going to interact going forward, and just like making that very clear. And then I think what's really necessary is to get some early wins. You need to like show them that you're not the old Kyle doing this other thing. You're the new Kyle helping them, adding value to them, and then they'll start to bring you in more. And that's how you're going to kind of build that new working relationship and working identity with your peers. So I'd say conversations and early wins was really important. How did you approach the like, oh, you're not Kaila, director of content at Morning Brew Learning. You're now Kaila, director of consumer revenue. Did you think about reframing your identity at all?
Yeah, but I think that for me, it was because it was more personal than it was professional. Like, because I was so closely tied to this like content and I was feeling burnt out. I was like, I don't want to write another word for the rest of my life. Like that, breaking that relationship of like, I am not just director of content at Morning Brew Learning. Like, and then rebuilding the identity, the work identity that I had created was like probably a 1-year process.
Yeah, definitely.
And so I wasn't thinking about like, oh, how do I reframe my relationship with all of these people that I've like seen around? I was like, I'm kind of working by myself right now, so I don't really need to like change the perception of that others have of me at this moment. As I started to become more confident in the fact that I had put work at arm's length and I wasn't as like emotionally attached to the identity that I had at work, I was actually able to build it back up. Like I was able to revisit who I was communicating with regularly and like show up to that with like, I guess like a better idea, more solid idea of who I was at work. And that I think was more positive, especially when I moved down to the like consumer side more directly. I think that really, really helped a lot. Yeah,
it's a great perspective. And the last thing I'll say on
this is the third last thing
on this topic is I think this is a storytelling narrative that whether you've survived a layoff or not, you can deploy at any point in your career, which is leveraging your past experiences and coming up with the narrative of like why this new role you're particularly suited for. And so, that is kind of what I did. One of Robert's like main initiatives was we retooled our event strategy, obviously in hand with our events team, which is like bonkers good. And I was like, oh, I'm running like a ton of our events for Morning Brew Learning. Like I definitely have a perspective I can share there. The other thing was like because I was director of community, we put about 4,000 people through these courses. I had worked or done a course with every single type of function. We had marketers, finance people, salespeople, analysts go through our courses, and because of that 3-year, I kind of like understood how those people tend to act, what they respond to, what they do, and I was like, as chief of staff, like I'm going to be working super cross-functional at Morning Brew, like. I didn't. If I would have gotten this job right out of college, like I just wouldn't have known what people did. Quite honestly, because of the course, I was like, oh, I get this. I had the scaffolding that made me a much more effective chief of staff, and I was able to like, tell that narrative because it was true. But I think tell that story. That storytelling is so important. Like being able to again collect a lot of dots and then connect them in a unique way. Super valuable, whether you've been laid off or not. That skill will be very valuable in your career. So definitely double down on that.
Yeah. So learning how to talk about this experience, I think, is vital when you're looking at your next steps or understanding what even happened to you.
That's right. Well, perfect segue into our last bucket we want to talk about, which is how to talk about this. If you've gone through a layoff, you've survived it, and then you're out with friends and they're like, oh, I saw there was a layoff. Like, what are you doing now? How did you think about that, talk about it? Do you feel like you have a good elevator pitch for your career narrative at Morning Brew Inc. now? Do you think that's important?
I think I do now, but I think when it happened, it was interesting because a lot of my close friends knew that I was really having a hard time. I was working really hard and I was kind of like getting a little too close to the work. And so they were all kind of like, why are you staying? And not like, ooh, tell me more about the draw, but it was like, are you sure?
Yeah, like, is this a good decision?
Yeah. And so not to say anything, obviously, like I was like, well, here's why I'm staying, because Morning Brew's best and this is blah, blah, blah. But like, I think it was interesting, or people were like, oh, I'm glad that you're doing something different now because I was worried about you, or, whatever.
You were in too deep, Kaila.
Is too deep? But no, I think like learning how to talk about it is obviously like a very important portion of the whole process, because it's just as much PR as it is reality. And I think that figuring out for you what makes the most sense and how you communicate this to your peers or to potential new hires, or if you're trying to get employed somewhere else.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it is just like a very personal, individual thing. What about you?
Yeah, I think it is a very important kind of meta skill, right? It goes back to this like storytelling, career narrative piece. And, the thing that has stuck out for me, and now with hindsight, what I learned a lot and like to talk about is we did in effect build that division from scratch.
Yeah.
There was 3 people at the start, and we did a lot of good. We scaled it, but what it taught me and what it proved I was capable of was building something from scratch and taking something that's an idea and actually actualizing it out in the world. And no matter what role you find yourself in, that skill will be one of, if not the most important skills you have. And so that's the narrative now, is like, I went through the highs and lows of building something ourselves inside of this company, and that entrepreneurial DNA only got strengthened. And whatever role I'm going to be in, I can take something from 0 to 1, and I've done it before. Did I take it from 1 to 100? No, because the division got shut down. But from 0 to 1, we made it happen. I think that is a great career narrative. The last thing I want to say on this entire topic, Kaila, is it's hard to, I think in the moment, like, I felt really bad for everyone that got laid off, obviously. I think that in hindsight, you often learn that like sometimes that is the best thing that happened to all parties. And I would say, and this is my own personal belief, of the people that I know that I was closest with in this division, yourself included, I think the layoff, looking back on it now, was a net positive for that total group. Not that every single person is in a better spot, but like if you added up all of the positive and negatives across those people, I think that the positives would outweigh the negatives. That's a really hard thing to wrap your head around right away. But I would say, like, in some cases, if a company is debating layoffs or not, like, the division probably isn't working. We could have spent another year grinding our butts off trying to make this thing work, and like it still might have not. And we've just been a year later in our lives. Like, sometimes ripping the Band-Aid off, it sucks in the moment and you feel the sting, but it's kind of what you needed to happen. And in a lot of ways, like, people are loyal. We all would have stayed until the very bitter end, I feel like. And it would have wasted a lot of our time. And now I look at where some of these people are now, and I'm like, fuck, crushing it. Like, that's like the coolest job I've ever heard of. And so again, like I've said this before, but life is very long. Things that feel shitty in the moment can end up being the best things. Things that feel great in the moment can end up being really shitty things. And you just don't know until like the full kind of tapestry of your life plays out. And so the more you can, when it's even hard, stay optimistic. You don't know what's around the corner. I think in this particular case, more good came of it than not, which is weird to say. And, if you're going through something similar, that is always a possibility. I'm not guaranteeing it, but it's always a possibility. I think that's maybe a nice kind of just note to end on. But
yeah,
final thoughts from you, Kaila.
What he said. No, I mean, I agree. And I think the best time to feel that emotion and to feel that sentiment is like later.
Yeah, you don't want to be like the next day, like, no, you got laid off, but you ever thought about how this could be the best thing that's ever happened to you?
Yeah, like it especially if you're coming from a position where you didn't get laid off. Maybe don't say that. But
I actually went on LinkedIn and I was like, to all my people laid off, this is the best thing that ever happened to you.
Yeah,
actually.
Yeah, but I do think, to reflect that sentiment, I agree. Like, I am so impressed and proud of everyone that was on this team. Like, they've all had these amazing careers, and I'm like so happy that we've been able to stay friends and that there was no like bad blood on any of the situation.
We have a podcast now.
I know we have a podcast. Yeah. but yes, I think it is true. And if you are going through something hard right now at work or wherever, like, it is true. Like, give it a minute, and it could be the best or the worst thing that happened, and you just don't know right now.
That's right.
Should we roll the credits?
Let's roll the credits. Our producer is Michaela Heck.
Our technical director is Jacob Smith.
Brittany DeTaco is our audio engineer.
And our president is Devin Emery.
This show is a production of Morning Brew.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See y'all.